Hello, everyone. I hope that you are all doing really well. My assistant and I are touching base on our next week of investigating the invisible gifted. Now, first off, I apologize. I am a day late in recording this. I have suddenly become an online teacher of five, six classes. So I am a little bit behind, and I apologize for that. I'm just kind of trying to hit a new stride. But I wanted to touch base real quick about the invisible gifted because this is such an important case study and just an important content in general. So, like all of my case studies, this is, of course, based on a real experience. Um, Jasmine is based on one of my favorite colleagues, and her name is Brittany. She's now a well accomplished researcher at the University of Tennessee. She started, along with one of our doctoral advisors at the time, a university school partnership between a Title I school and our gifted and creative education program. Now, this was a very similar response that she received from the principal. She approached the school and mentioned wanting to do some work in terms of gifted education, and the principal was at first pretty hands off and I made the wording a little bit more harsh in this case study for our purposes, but basically wasn't really convinced that gifted education was necessary in the current school environment. So there are a lot of reasons for this. And one thing that I really want to emphasize before we go any further is it's not because there are no gifted students at schools that receive federal funding. And it's also not that administrators don't care. Something that's really important to me to say up front is that resources are very thin when it comes to schools that have been identified as Title I schools, and oftentimes those resources are often people resources as well. So it would be hard to find a principal that really doesn't care about gifted education, but real world expectations when you're juggling so many things at once. Unfortunately, what happens is we let gifted kind of education kind of go to the side. There's a couple of reasons for that. Something that we really can't ignore is the lack of federal accountability for gifted ed. So we are not being held accountable for the performance of gifted students, or more importantly, for serving students who are identified as gifted. Now, we are being held accountable for things like adequate yearly progress and closing the achievement gap. So a lot of times accountability drives what's most important in the school. So a couple of reasons. Again, first we have that lack of federal funding, and also there's a very common assumption that gifted students are just okay on their own. And typically my response to that is, do you want all students to be just okay? And I strongly doubt that your answer is yes. Maybe gifted students can make it on their own, but it is at a great cost. We have huge issues of underrepresentation in gifted education, meaning that some of our most gifted students remain unidentified and then they're not challenged. And oftentimes that leads to underachievement, which can even lead to dropout. So that's not uncommon. There are also unique social and emotional needs for gifted students, and if we're not appropriately serving them, they definitely face some unique social and emotional challenges as well. So there's a lot going on, and it's just not okay for us to assume that gifted kids will be okay on their own, because we want to be more than just okay. So let's talk about a couple of things that could be done. Several of you guys gave great advice in the sense of providing a clear definition of giftedness, presenting some data about underrepresentation. There are certain graphics, infographics that I present all the time on underrepresentation in gifted ed, and they are definitely able to, get the attention of our administrators. Others mentioned some professional development, which I think is excellent. I was happy to see many of you mention the importance of cultural responsiveness. So when we look at issues of underrepresentation, we can't just focus on gifted education. We need to really combat some potential misconceptions, some potential assumptions as well. One thing that I kind of want to push back on is you guys presenting great ideas that most of them cost some money. And I don't want to ignore the fact that we don't always have that money. Not to discourage you, but I also want us to think creatively. So one thing that I have been exploring in my own research for the past year or so is using students who are identified as gifted to convince teachers and convince administrators that they need gifted education services. So a lot of times in education, the trick is to think strategically. I don't have a lot of money to do X. How else can I get this message through? So if we can't create this beautiful professional development with as many resources as we want, and if we're not sure that our colleagues will even read the articles that we share, or if we think they're just going to be on their email the whole time when we're trying to give a presentation, how can we convince our colleagues that we need gifted ed? So one thing that I've been really exploring and passionate about recently is giving students more of a voice. Most educators will listen to their students. Most educators complain that there's too much going on up at the top. We don't even have time to teach, right? We all say it. If you're a current student, you will say it at one point as you enter the teaching field. So teachers are oftentimes more apt to listen to their students than to listen to yet another required meeting. So what I've experimented with in the past, and I want you guys to do this week, is writing a letter from the perspective of a student who has gifted ability but has not been identified for gifted services. I call these letters see me statements. They are basically pleads from invisible gifted students for their teachers and their administrators to see them. And the power of these letters is the stories. So hard data is very convincing, but putting a face to that hard data is even more convincing. So your challenge for this week is a little bit more creative than some of our other work. This week, I want you to assume the role of a gifted student who is most likely, you can tell I've been teaching online all day, most likely not as apt to be identified. For example, maybe a student who is an English language learner. So they are highly gifted, but English is their second language, so it's difficult for them to express those gifts in English rather than their native language. So first off, you are assuming the role of a gifted student. You can choose whatever story you want. I've had students be minorities. I've had students be people who have grown up in poverty. Sometimes I have students who want to take this opportunity to write from their own perspective and actually plead kind of in retrospect that they wish they were noticed. Sometimes I have students assume the role of someone they know or their own children, but your goal here is to really become someone else. What would it feel like to be gifted and go unnoticed? What would it feel like to constantly get in trouble for not having your materials, for not paying attention, when you can really read 3 grade levels ahead of the rest of the class? What would it feel like for that teacher to constantly be on your case, but they don't recognize that you're bored? Okay, so your first goal is to really assume this character. And then you're writing a letter from the perspective of that invisible gifted student. Within that letter, you are painting an image of who you are. So, what is your name? Where do you live? What is your background? In that image of who you are in your daily life, I need to see evidence of giftedness. Now, that doesn't mean you say, I have a large memory capacity and I demonstrate curiosity. No, I want you to go look at those tabs and think, how would this manifest? Um, so I have been writing my own novel since I was 9. That's evidence of being gifted, but it's more of an example. Okay, so paint me a picture of who you are, provide some evidence that you are gifted. Be honest and discuss the challenges that you face as this gifted child, and then provide some practical suggestions for how your teachers or administrators could potentially help you with those challenges. Now, be strategic in this because a lot of your potential strategies for improvement may cost a lot of money. So, what are some things? Yes, monetary things, but also what could your teacher do tomorrow to better support you? In your writing, I want to see, I'm sorry, there's so much background noise when I work from home. In your writing, I want to see evidence that you have been reviewing the literature, reviewing the content in the library, and then also write carefully in terms of your grammar. Okay, so hopefully you just heard that. Just to recap, make sure you go to your Blackboard page and that you're looking at your rubric for the requirements here. Your main goal is to convince me that you are gifted and convince me that you need gifted services, not by giving me definitions, but rather by really just painting an image of what your life looks like. Again, this is such an important topic, and sometimes it takes stories and faces to convince others of the importance of gifted education. Um, I oftentimes use these in my own professional development. So when I do professional development about gifted, this is what I start with. I start with stories. And sometimes that's the best way to convince our colleagues that we really need to remain dedicated to gifted education. I hope that you guys are all safe in the midst of all of this. I realize that we already had an online course environment, but that being said, if anything comes up and you need support in any way, please do not hesitate to contact me. And thank you again for being patient as I'm adjusting to a lot of changes as well. Thanks, and I hope you have a great week.